I am going to show you how to make this Taylor Swift VMA look from 2023, and basically you're going to need a whole rainbow of denim, some lining, as well as some straps, foam cups, a 7-inch zipper, and also this lace-up cording for the back. And that's pretty much it. Just kidding, you will also need a pattern and some instructions, and I got you covered in that if you want to follow along and make this as well. Alright, let's get started. So let's start at the very beginning and cut out our pattern. Because this is a digital file, you'll need tape, scissors, and also I love this cutter tool here because you can cut these borders off all at once and it makes it so easy. I'm just cutting the bottom and then the right side of the paper, so I'm able to stack them on like you'll see here. I'm just going to take them and tape them together. I'm just trying to line up those gray triangles that are on the side and the bottom. Then after doing that a couple dozen times, the pattern will be ready for you to actually cut out, just cutting on that blue line so the seam allowance is included. And then once all the pieces are ready, we can whip out our fabric. I labeled them 1 through 5 because there are 5 different shades of denim for this, 1 being the lightest and 5 being the darkest. So here's the pattern, and you'll notice on your pattern pieces that it says up and down. That just basically means you'll put the pattern itself right side up like this, so the pattern facing upwards on that number of fabric, so the light to dark. So if it's up 4, you'll put it up like this on your fabric number 4, and if it's down 5, you'll turn the pattern upside down and place it down and then cut around it. And because that's really important for this project, just because we're trying to get all of these different shades of blue into the dress. So right side up is up, and then you'll turn the pattern around or upside down for when you're cutting the down shade of fabric. And so I began cutting the fabric out, and you'll notice that the fabric is always right side up. Just make sure the fabric is also facing you, and then make sure you flip the patterns up or down depending on what the pattern says. So this is the skirt front with all the different pieces, and this is the skirt back. And then I began just to sew them all together, just putting them right side together. This dress is really like a big quilt, and like we're making all of those pieces from these strips. And so just put right sides together for those skirt panels. It'll look kind of crazy, and then sew them together. Just make sure to not sew up the center back seam. Once those panels are together, we can move on to pinning the bodice, being sure to make sure they're all lining up together by the notches, and also be sure to look at this. Before you start sewing, make sure you get these 2 back pieces right sides facing up and right side facing down. Like, it's not like this because it can be kind of confusing because that kind of slant kind of keeps going, but just make sure you have everything up the right way. Once you have everything pinned, then we can go ahead and sew it together, and once you have that, you can press open the seams and see how pretty it is. And then I also just went ahead and clipped these little points off of the bottom front of the corset as well. Here's what it looks like with all the seams pressed, and now we can move on to the yoke. So now that I sewed and pressed these seams, I'm going to put on this front yoke piece, and I'm just going to do that by putting right sides together and slowly pinning these curves. It's kind of weird because we're putting a round curve, a concave on a convex. So I'm just going to slowly, little bit by little bit, pin these edges together. And make sure when you are lining it up that this seam on the other side is opened up as well, so it's not going to bunch and gather in the back. So this is what it looks like when it's all pinned. And now I'm able to sew 5/8 away on that raw edge there. So now that this is sewn on, I'm going to take my scissors and I'm just going to clip all of these curves here to help open it up. So I'm cutting through both layers of the seam allowance and making sure I don't cut the stitches. Alright, so now that I've clipped those curves, I'm going to take this to the iron and press open the seam. And so now that we have this pressed here, we're going to add our bone channels here. And there's just going to be bones in these vertical seams, not on this horizontal one. You can if you want, but the way I'm going to show it is not going to do that because I don't really think it's necessary. So what we're going to do now is sew the bone channels onto this using the seam allowance. So how we're going to do that is we are going to line up our presser foot next to these seams and just sew next to it. But what side are we going to sew on? We're always going to sew on the outside of the seam. So if this is the inside right here, this center front, we're going to sew on the other side, or the outside. And so for this seam, we're going to sew right here, shoink, on this piece. For this seam, we're going to sew on this side of it, so on this side. For this seam, we're going to sew on the light part here. And then for this back piece, we are going to sew on the outside on this piece, if that makes sense. And so how it translates to the other side is it will be the reflection of that. And so if this is the center, we're going to sew on the outside of the seam. And so we'll sew here, 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 and here. And I'll show you what that looks like as we go to the machine. Welcome to the machine. Okay, so that's the center front, and then I'm going to sew on the outside of this seam. So I'm literally just dropping my presser foot down and stitching. You'll notice I'm paying special attention to keeping that seam right on the side of my presser foot. That's how you get really straight lines, is you just stare and keep the presser foot right on that seam. And what I mean by stare is I literally just stare at that point and just try to sew right on that line, and then they usually come out pretty good. Here's what it looks like on the inside, and then this is the outside. And so once we have those channels in place, we're not going to put the bones in, we're actually going to move on to the lining. For the lining, you can completely disregard the up and down, all that hoopla, just go as normal and cut out 2 of each piece for just the bodice, and make sure also that the yoke piece, so that top piece at the front, is also made out of that denim, just so if it peeps through the top or whatever, you only see denim, you don't see whatever lining that you chose. And so I'm just cutting these lining pieces out, and then I'm going to sew them together as normal. And this is such a side note, but if you wanted to make this dress in something different than denim, just look how cute it would be. I love it. I'm kind of tempted to go back with this same kind of cotton material and make another dress because the lines are just so pretty. But anyway, back to the construction of this dress. It's time to put the yoke onto the lining. By now, you know what to do. It's the same as before. We're just going to sew those curved seams together and then press open and clip the seam allowance. Alright, so at this point we have the outer portion of the bodice as well as the lining, and now it's time to put them together. And so what we're going to do actually first is get out our straps. In Taylor's version, the actual dress that Taylor wore, she had straps just like this that were adjustable, and they were black also like this. And so I'm just going to use a already made strap for this. And so it's nice because I won't then have to measure anything. I can just sew them on, and when I put the dress on, then I'll be able to make it fit me well. So the straps that I have are actually for a bra, and so what I'm going to do is literally on the side without the adjuster, just cut this off, and then this one right here is going to be our front strap. And so I'm going to put right sides together, which the front of this adjuster is the right side, so I'm going to flip this and put this right here on this point of the bodice, and then just pin that in place and try to make it right in the center like this. You can even measure. So because this is an adjustable strap, I am going to have some way for it to have like a loop in the back, if that makes sense. It has this bit here, and so I'm gonna have to do mine a little bit differently than if you had one that doesn't have this hook. I'm just working with what I got, and I could technically make it fit me and then just stitch through both of these layers here and just leave it stationary like this, but then I won't have the mobility of changing the strap, say if someone else wants to wear it or whatever. But if you did make your own strap, or if you have one that is different and it doesn't just loop at the end of it, then you can literally do the same thing like this, put the right side together and then stitch over that. I just have to do something differently because of this. I'm just gonna leave this guy out, and you can go ahead and just sew over these 2 points here if you want, or if you're feeling more adventurous, you can just sandwich it in between the lining, because now we can put the lining with right sides together and sew along the entire top. And how we're going to actually do that though is by lining up all the edges and then stitching at those perimeters. Sorry, the brain was just activated right there, and so I was like, what am I doing? And so we're just gonna pin around these edges, lining everything up as perfectly as we can, and then we will sew around the perimeter. And so when we are sewing these pieces together, we're going to make sure that when we are doing these points right here, that we don't, when we come back down or go up, go through the strap. We only want to sew the strap right here when we are going on this horizontal portion right here. So again, we don't want to stitch it, the strap, this black strap in here, when we're going up and down. We want to just miss it and only sew the strap right here at this top part. And so I pinned from end to end, and now it is ready to sew. A little tip for getting the front straps to be really clean is to actually just put your needle down and then pivot the point there. So pivot the foot, and then also when you're sewing over the strap, you get bonus points if you do a little back stitch there just to secure it in place. And then just put your needle down again and pivot and do the rest. Because this neckline has some curves to it, we are going to clip the seam allowance, and I also went ahead and cut a lot of that seam allowance, especially at the strap points there, just because it gets really thick in there, especially with the strap, and denim already is pretty thick. So I kind of went crazy and cut a lot of the seam allowance out, also because I've done a mock-up for this already and already know that it's going to look great. And so when that all is finished and all your seams are clipped, you can flip it right side out. One of the best ways to make sure the lining stays inside is to understitch, and I just did that by stitching the seam allowance that's on the inside to the lining. And because it's really hard to stitch where the strap is and at those curves, I did have to do this in 3 different parts. And now it's time to give our bodice some structure. I'm just using some basic zip ties to put these in as bones, and when we are cutting them, we just have to make sure that we cut them 5/8 of an inch or 1.58 centimeters shorter than the entire boning channel that we've already made. And that is just so later on when we attach the bodice, we won't be sewing through bones. Make sure to add a bone to every channel, and once you have those completed, then we can move on to adding some foam cups to the lining. This is a great step because it means, hey, you won't have to worry about wearing a bra if you don't want to. So when you first start doing this step, make sure you try on the bodice and pin where the foam cups should hit for you. And then once you have that position, then you can go ahead and whip stitch it down. I just decided to sew it in 3 different points instead of doing the whole perimeter because I have better success of getting it to lay flat and look right just by doing a couple points. Just a couple whip stitches and that's it. It's a pretty simple step. And now we're going to give some love to our future self and measure 5/8 of an inch on both the denim and the lining center back. This is just going to help us in the future, but with that being said, now we're going to move on to attaching the top to this skirt. And how we're going to do that is press under the bottom edge of the bodice by 5/8 of an inch. And then we're just going to put the two together. So put the top right on top of the top edge of the skirt and then just top stitch. So this is really easy, especially to get this point really crisp. Here's the skirt, and now I'm just going to put the top over it. And so what you'll need to do is take a marker, something to mark with, and mark 5/8 all the way around it, and then this line that we mark here on the skirt is going to be where we put the fold. How I'm going to start is I'm going to line up the side seam of the top with the side seam of the skirt. That's a good place to start at, just so we know where they need to hit and so we don't get off at any point. And again, I'm looking down at the line here and putting that fold right on the line. So I have it all pinned, and now I'm ready to sew along this bottom edge on this fold and attach the top to the bottom. Here is that top stitching, and now we're ready to cut out the seam allowance. You want to make sure you cut some of it out at least, just so there's not a lot of bulk at the waist. And now perhaps this is the final boss. We are going to do the corset back. We're first going to cut out that strip and make double fold bias tape. So first taking the ends, folding it towards the center, and then folding it again like that. Give it a good press, and then we're going to stitch it down on that fold. So basically close the strap up at that fold, and then we're going to cut in between those notches to create the little folds that will create the loops to make it a corset back. But before we can attach them, we of course need to mark their placement with the notches on the center back bodice piece, and then we can fold those little straps. And then these 2 steps are very important. Make sure the loops face towards the bodice and that the ends of the loop are somewhat in the seam allowance, so that when you stitch them down and fold that center back edge inward, the ends of the loops will be inside of the bodice. And so this is how we'll finish the center back. We'll just take those folds and put them on top of each other like this. Then just pin the folds together. Yes, over those loops, it's going to be kind of weird to sew, but also when you're doing this step, make sure to fold under the lining at the waist, because when we finish that back edge, we want to make sure that the lining will be in place and ready when we go ahead and stitch the waistline later. That's a lot, so just go slow with this step. Also, the instruction manual kind of breaks it down also, but just make sure that that waistline is folded under and everything is lining up. And to finish the edge, we're just going to do 2 rows actually of stitching, one really close to that fold and one about 3/8 of an inch away to create a boning channel, because that's important to hold up the structure of the back when we lace it up so it will be nice and straight. So I cut the 2 bones out and inserted them into the channels, and now we are ready to finish up the lining. To do this, we're just going to fold under the bottom edge of the lining inward by 5/8 of an inch. It should line up right with the stitch line that should be visible, and whip stitched it down, being sure to not stitch through the outside layer of fabric. And now we can move on to finishing the back of the dress. And so I did that by first sewing up the skirt, stopping 7 inches above at the top, and then putting in a zipper. And you could just do this by top stitching the zipper in place, or I went ahead and just did an invisible zipper, but it definitely was tricky because the inside's already kind of folded from doing the loops in the back of the bodice and how it all connects. So I would recommend doing this, and then also make sure you sew a hook and eye at the top of this zipper. And also we can attach that back strap if you haven't. I just whip stitched it. It doesn't look the greatest. I could have definitely put it inside the bodice, but this was the best solution I had at the time. And so that's what I did for the strap. And now lastly, if you want to add a modesty panel, so behind the stitching, just a little bit of fabric to cover up your back, you can put the right sides together after you cut that piece out, and then sew around the perimeter, leaving a 2-inch opening that you see here. And then once you have that, go ahead and cut the seam allowance like I'm doing here. Then you can simply fold it right side out, give it a good press, and then we can whip stitch it to our bodice. Make sure when you're placing it down that the opening section there is the part that is getting sewn to the dress, just so when you whip stitch it down to the bodice, it will also close up that hole. And that's pretty much it. The modesty panel should look like this, and now you are ready to lace up your bodice and wear it for the first time.